Welcome everyone to the third session of the second day of Gala Connected, Gala's first ever virtual event. And well, good afternoon, America. Good evening, Europe. And if someone is joining from Asia, it's late at night and it's all my respect, and you are all very welcome if there's anyone from those parts of the world. And this session will be a panel, a 1-hour panel, led by Matan Sivaloganathan. I'm really sorry if I mispronounce your name. We've been colleagues for years, and I never had to pronounce your entire name. Actually, I have to say that. Matan hails from SDL, and will be leading this panel. The speakers are Jeff Beatty from Mozilla, James Lin from Uber, Aaron Schlim from Localize, and this is it. And the topic is what comes next, and it's about the technology, the whole scope, the entire scope of technology that organizations use. If you want to put a really nerdy term on that, is the technology stack as we see it, the technology stack as we foresee it. And I don't think I should go into this more, but give the floor to Matan and the speakers, and they will introduce themselves and do the rest. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Balázs. Hello, everyone. Happy to have you, everyone here, the panelists, and everyone in the audience. As you know, unfortunately, we cannot see you in person or personally, so you have to bear with us to do this digitally. Let's jump right ahead. A little bit about myself. Matan is my name. I'm working at SDL as the sales director for the EMEA team. Non-regulated commercial enterprises is, I think, the métier I'm mainly dealing with. I think, to put it short and sweet, by heart, computational linguist. By passion, sales, been into different positions, and I mainly concentrate on to holistically looking at this industry, and of course how we can help with the solutions we have in this industry to everyone outside the industry. So much about myself. I'd like to ask my panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Jeff.
Well, I am the senior head of localization at Mozilla. We make the Firefox browser for, just in case Mozilla does not ring a bell, Firefox almost certainly will. I've been at Mozilla for 9 years. Actually, today is my 9-year work anniversary, so that's exciting. And I'm here because I lead a team of program managers and engineers that have had involvement in creating technology through the full spectrum of the localization lifecycle. We have created runtime localization systems within our software interfaces. We've designed and architected our own TMS, and we've also gone out and purchased our own enterprise TMS a couple of times. So the whole spectrum, I've got some experience in my hands in a little bit of everything.
Thank you, Jeff. Also, congratulations on your work anniversary.
Thank you.
I continue with James.
Hi, my name is James. I'm a senior operation program manager at Uber. It's been here close to 4 years now, almost on my Uber university. My job at Uber, I have been wearing so many hats because due to the scalability and the environment. But my main focus has always been the same, which is to optimize the end-to-end transition workflow through various type of the requests that we receive from our product lines, and the different categorization of the service at Uber that we offer. Uber is a global company that localized into 48+ languages, and we provide the ride sharing and e-business to over 900 cities worldwide. I'm here today to bring some of my view on how we, as of 4 years ago, which is the infancy stage, to build the entire localization team from the ground up, to where we are now, the transition phase through some of the strategic, smart thinking, managed and AI-ready workflow that I can definitely share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Last but not least, Aaron, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Of course. So I'm Aaron Schlimm. I am presently a solution architect at We Localize, and my role at We Localize is primarily leading our AI enablement practice. So in my previous lives, I've really done everything in the language industry, from being a language teacher, a second language teacher, to being a medical interpreter, to being a translator, to being a DTP specialist when I started my first company, to really the last 20 years playing executive roles, whether that's related to leading sales and marketing or leading solutions in my most recent gig before this with Bureau Works. So my experience really is around the vendor side of the equation and figuring out how does one work with clients in order to architect systems that are going to, support the client's needs while also producing efficient operations on the vendor side, so that we can, harmonize the entire operation, but then also make sure that we're delivering quality and the lowest possible cost and time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, first of all, for the introduction. Now, to the audience, the main idea behind this conversation is, and as you read the description, but I think it's always interesting to know what we really want to achieve with this conversation. In the first half, we really would like to touch upon several different aspects, how technologies are transitioning, or is it really now something where we can say these are the technology stack we're going to use for the next decade? And the other question is, and this goes into the second half, is we would like to open up at some point in the conversation also involving you, what your thoughts are. The main idea about this conversation is really to ask ourselves, when we're looking at the technology landscape, we have, I like to take that example from the vinyl, cassette, the CD, and then the digital age. Where are we in this industry? And to start off, I would like to ask the panelists specifically about their general view about the current technology landscape. And instead of really asking every single person the same question, I'd really like to start with Mozilla and Jeff in particular, how he sees the language technologies in this industry, and then specifically the localization and workflow in this industry.
Thanks. Yeah, I have seen over the course of the last, I would say 10 years, an explosion in new solutions. I think that for a long time there was a bit of a lag in catching up with the advancements that different buyers were making in the localization process. And now it seems more and more companies are adopting bigger, better solutions, or even coming up with creative solutions themselves. One of the things that I really like about the current technology landscape is the fact that we're moving away, I think, or I feel, we're beginning to move away from these one-stop solutions where you've got one big TMS that does it all, and more toward decentralized TMS solutions with microservices like terminology and different areas of support. So I think that is good, and it's been really helpful, at least at Mozilla, as we've gone about looking for enterprise solutions to solve different problems. It's been much easier to find solutions that can not only plug into whatever enterprise TMS we find, but can also plug into our in-house open source TMS that we use with our community.
Talking about TMS, thank you, Jeff. How is James at Uber seeing TMS and CAT tools within the company, and your general view on the current technology landscape, particular with those two aspects?
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, made a great point, right? Because the language technology, the landscape overall, it is an interesting topic, and it really depends, excuse me, on the size of the company. For Uber, right, our technology, when we started, it's very similar to other company that that I work with in the past. We have our internal CMS and connected to the TMS that as a unification, so we can have this entire workflow funnel through one end as a CMS client side, to the TMS side. But the underlying problem or the workflow that we have seen in the past in the new integration are very unique. Since as Uber we have dozens of like different type of combination, like service type, content type, request type, different product lines, that has to feed into different area expertise within the transition, workflow, and where the transition landed will be the vendor side, where different linguists will have to translate based on the different content type, legal, marketing side, and etc. We do have to work collaboratively not only on the transition vendors, but in our side, the tech side, the tech vendor, will have to also improve as well through the speed and some sort of analytics platform to support for MT. But of course, right, this sort of unification I mentioned, it has a lot of limitation and drawback, and how far we can rely on, even single vendor or different vendor that we work with, because we are continuing to evaluate, our current landscape within, our tech stack. And we are, continue to reach out to, as each of our mentioned about middleware, that he could provide a great example that we can definitely look into to see how we can also address a gap, through different sort of like different understanding, such as the quality, how to manage the quality, how to track authentic delivery, and maybe there are topic about RPA or robotic processing automation of bots that sort of replace mundane tasks that how TMS is operating. And lastly, that if everything else fail, we do have to build internally. That's something that we have built, such as the intelligent routing, engine that will dynamic route our content through a customized workflow, so that the linguists that expert and really good at this particular topic can able to start the translation without having to really searching for term in glossary.
Thank you, James. Let's stay for a while with the in-house and the commercial systems. And this is especially when you were pointing out to proprietary systems, what you build in-house, and then where you say, okay, this is the point where we would like to go with the commercial system. I'd like to throw the ball back again at Jeff. Can you tell me about how do you select in-house? When do you select whether it should stay in-house or commercial? And of course, is it determined by the workflow you do, or are there different other aspects to be considered?
So for us, we've done both. We operate a hybrid model because we're an open source project and a nonprofit. A lot of our product user interfaces, or I should say all of our product user interfaces, are localized through volunteer communities all around the world. So when we made the decision that we had to find a commercial solution to facilitate localization for our vendor projects, because we do both community and vendor, really that was based on trying to create a separation of concerns. A community ecosystem is very delicate, and it can be very easy to overturn the apple cart when introducing paid players within that same ecosystem. So we started having an in-house solution because there weren't any solutions on the market that really helped us to manage a community workflow the way that we wanted to. And then we moved and adopted this hybrid approach and went out in search of an enterprise solution so that we could separate those concerns and utilize a different workflow for our vendors. So that's kind of the driving force between that decision is how do we maintain the ecosystem of the community and still send work to vendors when needed.
Thank you. Aaron hasn't said much, so I would like to jump into, we have heard now from Uber and Mozilla their take on the general view and whether it's an in-house and whether if it's an in-house or commercial system. Can you share with us what's the vendor's perspective, or when you look at this sort of challenges Uber or Mozilla is forcing, what's your perspective, and give us a little bit of insight how you tackle these challenges?
Yeah, I think maybe the most important thing in that conversation, where I find a lot of variability, is thinking about what is the actual objective, right? So Jeff made a good point about saying that they were looking at a particular situation where they had a community they wanted to engage, and they couldn't find a way to do that in the right way, but they knew what they wanted, right? They knew an end result. What I often find in conversations with clients is that often the end result is not clear. Often a client will just say, well, we want to just revamp our TMS. We want a new TMS. This one's not good enough. And they might have a general idea of we want to just save money or we want it to be more efficient. But typically what I hear is a lot of feature-driven talk. So I'll hear people say, well, we want a new system because we want an in-context editor for InDesign files and for web interfaces or for mobile interfaces, right? And not that there's anything bad about that. I mean, we all would like an in-context editor for mobile interfaces. However, that, in my opinion, should not be the driving motivation behind why you're looking for a new system, nor should it be a list of features that then define, is this the right fit for us? I think there needs to be a more holistic conversation that thinks about what are the business results that you are trying to drive. And then let's back it back, from the business results into what is a really good fit, taking into account both existing technologies where there's an investment, because that's a real thing. If you have been investing for years in your own in-house technology, or let's say you've deployed something off the shelf, but you've customized it. There's a lot of engineering hours that have gone into that, and you don't just throw that away. At the same time, you also have to be willing to throw some things away. That's I guess the flip side of this is that I often see people have invested a lot in a system and then want to really innovate, but want to hold on to everything really tightly. So you have to be willing to also just let go of some aspects of your approach if you're going to find a new sweet spot. I think I'm kind of all over the place on my answer on this, but does that make sense?
It does. And I would now pick something. I like the holistic approach, because at the end of the day, it's products and services is a combination, and solution and going holistically towards a customer or towards any big challenges, I think at the end of the day, what matters. But breaking it down to, I always call it the reality check. One of the aspects when we talk about a vendor's perspective is cost saving. Where do I get the most value out of it? Can you maybe also elaborate a little bit on how you contribute as a vendor to cost saving when it comes to technology? And now specifically talking about Uber and Mozilla.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think cost savings is really about specificity and communications between systems. So, if I'm looking at a particular architecture with a client, there has to be a couple of goals. One of them is, how are the systems going to communicate, right? We want to avoid human interruption of the flow as much as possible. So part of that is then looking at just basic API interactions between whichever system the client is running and our system. It also is looking at then sort of the new generation of technologies, like, as James was saying, robotic process automations, right? Are there aspects that an API cannot achieve for us, but that we could use an RPA in order to, again, remove a human step in that process? And then the other piece of it is just the metadata that comes along with these requests, right? So it's one thing to move content back and forth between systems, but the other thing is really getting clear about how are we going to move the information about urgency, the information about the quality level that is required for that particular piece of content. So I think that's where, in order to save money, the vendor can certainly vendors have a lot of great strategies to save money. The problem is, when do you apply the right strategy to the right content, and how can that be achieved without having to have a project manager on the client side and a project manager on the vendor side, both emailing back and forth in order to make decisions about what we're going to do, where we've just basically spent all the money we hope to save, and we spent all the time that we were supposed to save. So I guess those are my keys really, is how do we make content clear? How do we know things about the content through the metadata and the project requests? And then how do we move things as efficiently as possible through probably a mix of technologies? Because as we know, there's no one system that does it all, you know? So then it's an even more complex solution, right? Because it's not just what's the API, it's what's the overall picture for all of these different content types.
But this is something in my previous conversation, and I would like to ask James about this. And I know that at Uber you have a means of measuring cost savings. Can you a little bit go into the specifics?
Yes, thanks for the question. As a client, right, we are measuring KPI, or measuring the cost. But is that really the bottom line that we're looking at? When we mention that to vendors, and there's always one sentence one of the articles I read in the past, and that's still embedded in me, is that you can change what you don't measure, and not everything that can be counted. And this applies very well within the localization and language industry as well, because at Uber, we develop KPI in essence just to develop the return on investment, or ROI, and we use our foundation to measuring them, right? Assemble as process, the goal we want to reach, and also the satisfaction that the customer or stakeholder are looking for. Those measurements, especially on the process side, it's so critical to the success, the goal that we're reaching, and of course that yield in the customer satisfaction. And most people think KPI and ROI goes together in parallel, but then in that case, right, we do have the measurement based on the language, because Uber supports more than 40 languages, and we have divided by tier level. Each tier, right, is indicating that this is a higher tier, means that we have more rider and driver, more eaters, versus lower tier, that's less of the language that are used based on the global rollout. So you see, right, this multi-layered language that we created, and then the homework that we're doing right now, we can definitely tweak the numbers a little bit based on the KPI and ROI, because as I mentioned, that the higher tier is more important, meaning that we would like the KPI and ROI to be at the highest standard. But if you look at the middle tier and lower tier, this is kind of cool, because you can definitely play with the numbers, and if you play the number right, you can definitely drive up the return on investment, even though let's say the KPI doesn't met on a monthly basis. And since we from our 48 languages, about close to more than 50% of our languages are offering at the lower tiers, and the saving for us is a lot higher than some of the the language that we're offering. So KPI is very important, and even though, as I mentioned, right, we push that KPI to our vendors, but then we also want to include the driving of success to ensure that this return investment is also worth it based on the KPI that we are working with vendors.
Thank you. I always need to unmute myself. I would like to, and this is something in our previous conversation, and this is something looking at those two companies, Mozilla and Uber, you follow a different, let's call it a DNA. Mozilla is openly an open source tool, and therefore it's, I guess, more into an open source community. And Uber, as I assume, is probably more into a narrowed vendor selection. We would like to have something very narrowed. And I would like to know if, when you're looking at depicting now this DNA into technology, can you a little bit share with us how do you see, when you are looking with this DNA at this technology landscape? Jeff, to get started, and then I'd like to know what James thinks.
Yeah, because of the open source nature of our company and our products, as well as the mission-driven mandate that we have to preserve the internet as a global public resource accessible to all. When we are looking at technological solutions to help us localize, very often we have to spend more time addressing the needs of under-resourced languages that have limited digital representation, and for whom this Firefox may be the very first product that's ever localized for it. So a lot of our focus on technological solutions revolves around equitability and revolves around how do we ensure, for example, with our community effort, how do we ensure that we're offering the same feature set to everyone and that everyone finds the right value from that feature set. So that makes things difficult, for instance, when it comes to machine translation and implementing machine translation in the community workflow. We don't, for instance, turn on pre-translation by default for anything, because we recognize that that advantages some languages and some communities and disadvantages others. We're very judicious about that and consult with our community about whether or not that is a useful tool and useful feature for them in the localization process before we go about implementing it. So for us, it's all about that whole perspective of accessibility and creating equitable solutions.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, mute. Yes. For Uber, not that we are too close or in our close environments. We maybe in the past, about 4 years ago, we initially, when we look at vendor, is about speed, quality, and cost saving. Not so much about cost saving, but just like, what we have to invest this money. That's speed and quality. That's focus on that, because 4 years ago we expand really quickly. One city or sub-region a month, or even less than a month, or even sport, like, more language on a monthly basis. Like we rolled out in France, in French back in July of 2019 or 2015. And every year, right, we adding half a dozen languages, and that's really scaled up really quickly, and especially on the expansion side. And that's why when we look at vendor, we really would like have them to start supporting this top 10 language in the first phase. And after that, right, we start going on to the niche market, smaller market, Khmer, Burmese, Middle East, and also India. Those are the ones that it's harder for us to really look into it, because this real languages, and which I will talk about in my next session about how to really recruit this talent, translator. But if you think about it, right, vendor selection is very important, at least from our side now. Now that after 4 years we have so much experience with the vendor that we picked, and it's about how they can partner with you through the journey of exploration, trials and error that I must say, and in the end, right, it's maximized for success through our business objective and achievable solution. And of course, right, the vendor and our side, with that, we do have to understand the life cycle and of the offerings, through nowadays through AI or intelligent model. But come down to it is about measuring the data, right? Because data helps us to really understand where are we currently, the past, through QBR, but then next phase, what are we going forward, so that we can continue to evolve and improve based on our company expanding, and then make sure that the vendor that we work with do have this whole, communication, and also how make sure that there's a quality control matrix in place to make sure the quality and also, the cost, as well as, to deliver how, of course, like come down to it, it's assessment to the score that we receive from the vendors. But at the end of the day, right, what we're looking for is, partnership, and also, about how we can, the vendor can present the data to us, in a more friendly and readable way, so that we can really understanding that what sort of assessment that we need to take in the end, that we can set for the maximum success and great experience. Because if there's a great side from my side and their side, if we have great people, happy people, they are, we can definitely produce a higher productivity, and in the end, right, I can see that a great result coming from the vendor as well.
Thank you. Now let's look into the future, and this is how I really would, why I'm really almost obsessed with asking you how technology will evolve, and what does it really need, what you need to have, or where you think technology needs to meet these criteria to say that's where the next step is. In order to answer that question, there are two things I would like to tick off on the list. As you know, there are these two magic words in every conversation. The one is, of course, machine translation. But I really want to know briefly what do you, a critical view on machine translation in general from you. And then I'd like to go into what comes beyond machine translation. And I'd like to start with Jeff, going through James, and then I would like to know from Aaron, maybe what's beyond the machine translation aspect. Jeff?
So I'm actually going to start by not addressing the machine translation aspect directly. I really strongly feel that there are several paradigms within the localization ecosystem that need to be broken. One of which treats localization as a static exercise. And maybe the workflow is dynamic, but when an end user is presented with a localized user interface, it very often is static. And that does not accurately represent the needs of each and every language and each and every user. Very often it results in clunky UI localization or unnatural UI localization. And I think that in the software industry in general, we need to find a better solution to personalize and make localization more dynamic for our users. Secondly, now with regard to machine translation, one direction that I'd really like to see machine translation go in, and maybe this isn't specific to machine translation providers as a whole, but maybe this is more of a middleware, a layer that needs to live on top of machine translation. But I really believe that there are opportunities for bettering the results and output of machine translation based on context. Now, when I say context, I'm not meaning linguistic context or co-text. What I'm talking about is if we're talking localization of a website or localization of a software user interface, very often the TMS platforms will have an in-context editor that has identified the parameters within which each text element appears. The function, whether it's a text element on a button, the dimensions of that button, all of that is metadata that could be used to be able to filter out bad machine translation outputs or machine translation outputs that are just not suitable, I guess, for localization for that particular UI, and come up with a better output that is more appropriate for that context. So it's less about linguistics and more about the visual aspect and the constraints within a user interface. I feel like there's more that could be done in that area.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, I would mention about what Jeff mentioned about, the constraint within the source in the second half. But then, in regards to MT, our goal is to use MT 4 years ago. And you know what, we have submitted 100% of contents to MT. It's something a huge accomplishment from our team to really try that forward. But, right now our transition now is not really focus on MT because MT is just everywhere, either you use it or don't use it. If you don't use it, there are some, some context that we're missing, some, pain point that you had in the past. But others to us, right, we are using MT because the number one factor is cost saving and a faster turnaround time that, we want to use MT because, the more that we continue to MT, using the retraining models, the cost saving will increase, not drastically, but then it really depends on the languages. Some complex language like Chinese or Japanese is a lot more harder than, let's say, in ASCII format like like UK or even French. But then of course, like, a different training model would also affect different edit distance as well. But then as we are transitioning to just not MT but post MT, which I know that Aaron will speak more about it. But then our thought is as follow, right? Because MT right now is just a single MT that runs through most of our content type. But what if that our MT were able to dynamic select based on like, hey, this content type is this based on what Jeff mentioned about metadata. Should I load in different MT engine? or should I parallel with multiple engines, right? Because imagine this, right? If you have legal contents that go through our pipeline, MT pickup based on this metadata, and it knows that, hey, we should have this MT instead of this MT because this is legal. We need a higher trained model to use this for legal translation. Some sort of ML assessment that has a data that you can adjust that this is something that we trust this MT engine to localize this legal. Moreover, let's say a request that is urgent, then this sort of ML will recognize that we should have multiple MT to run to make sure that we have a higher rate of success to getting the best higher matching rate, so that we can skip additional workflow, and in yield we can return this translation back quickly. So that everything that comes down to it is the algorithm or some sort of business logic in this that will decide it when to and how to evaluate, and especially where the content's coming from, right? Because other content's coming from upstream. And then I remember that we did a study in the past that the less words, simple sentence, and I believe one of the speakers mentioned that the less or simple sentence that's easy to read will yield a higher accuracy of MT to translate, and in the end will better quality than, let's say, longer sentence and complex grammatical. And that will definitely something that we are looking right now, because we want to make sure that this MT, post MT we will have will be a lot more smarter. But of course, you might wondering that, hey, English source is basically the source of content that coming through MT. MT can only know so much, can only train so much. How do you adjust that? And this another journey that I would like to mention is that we're also working with our vendor and our content writer to go through to feed this information so that we could use like NLP, for example, in that language, natural language processing, a software to analyze the source readability in a sentence complexity, that so that it generates some sort of universal matrix to predict the translation quality. And this measurement is really cool because it's sort of based on the stylistic adherence and the grammatical rule, or some sort of content classification that will overall be able to improve the source quality. And that when that completed, go through the MT, and I think that we will have a really awesome this end-to-end workflow that using MT will basically go through all the translation without any human intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions. I can see two questions. Before Aaron, I would like to know from Aaron one important factor, and then I would like to go into the questions which has been asked. As James said, we have MT and things are improving, but when we're looking at beyond machine translation, this is very important. I'm not talking about marketing related beyond MT and now looking into AI. What's tangibly happening, and where do you see the machine translation into true multilingual AI, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that I think about it is that I think machine translation is just becoming a part of the baseline tool set that everybody uses. It's really not sort of the cutting edge anymore of where we're going. I think machine learning and AI is really where there's a lot more that we can be exploring. So just a few, I mean, I could speak for an hour on this, but just a couple of like thoughts on it would be, I think that there's a lot that we can do as it relates to QA. So how can we use NLP tools and machine learning to better focus our efforts when we're looking at quality management, right? So rather than just having a translation and then a review, could we do things like James was suggesting, where we're using machine learning to predict the requirement of doing another quality pass? Can we actually use machine learning to determine which particular strings need attention, looking at different signals in the data set? So smart LQA, one thing that we can look at. I think that another area for improvement is just using robotic process automation. And I know there's a question on that. I won't go too far into that, but RPA is a great way to use those, is to think about maybe a client has a legacy technology. They definitely don't have an API for it, and they're not going to write an API for it. Could we use an RPA so that we can still make use of that system in an efficient way without having to switch to a whole new platform? But I think the bigger picture, and where I spend a lot of my effort nowadays, is really building out data sets for neural machine learning. We have an opportunity now with neural where the size of the data does not need to be what it once was in order to start to have a machine learning engine learn something, right? To produce something tangible. So I think there's a real market for high quality, but maybe not huge volume data sets. And ultimately what I see is a future where a lot of the multilingual interactions are not at all driven by the source target paradigm. We don't ever go from source target. We simply generate in target language in reaction to a target language prompt. And you see a lot of that now in the chatbot technology, in the personal assistant technology. But I think that's a lot of where we're going. And in many ways, it makes sense, right? There's no need to sort of go through this. Here's all the English possibilities. Let's translate them. And then let's try to like create rules on what we're going to show people. If we have the technology to actually build the interactions in language, where everything is happening in the language, that to me is a very powerful approach. Some might worry that then is at the end of translation, and I don't think that's true at all. I mean, I think that just there's always a market, and that, like, I think people have made this point before, the volume of words, the volume of interactions that we need to support at a global scale in different languages is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger exponentially. I think that using AI, multilingual AI, and really focusing on smart data set creation is a way that we could facilitate some of those interactions in a more meaningful and dynamic way, while also not producing, you know, an apocalyptic situation where there's no more translation. So I reject that notion that AI somehow is going to remove this. I even reject the notion that AI would, even though I've made this point a few times, take project manager jobs away. I don't think that's reality. I think it means that project managers can do something more interesting with their time rather than clicking buttons on a TMS or in some sort of internal project management system. They can be thinking, they can be collaborating with clients about content, thinking about markets and demographics, and really being more using their global skills as opposed to their administrative skills. And I think that's a benefit for everybody.
Thank you. Very much like the point what you made. There is one aspect, and this is really when especially staying with for a while with what you just said, and this is about the demand and expectation, and with changing transition. The three aspects constantly being considered is scalability, how modularized you can go along with technology, and of course, how do you customize? Just a couple of quick words, because I already see there is another question coming in. Just a couple of words on your side, just to continue, Aaron, and then James and Jeff, and I'd like to then go to Zoltan about his question. When you consider those three aspects, specifically when you're looking at demand and expectation, and what you just said is things are changing, is it easy to scale, modularize, and of course customize, taken into consideration where we are heading with the AI aspect?
Yeah, it's not easy at all. I mean, I think it's very challenging because the more, sometimes you need to modularize because one size does not fit all. And sort of Kostya had made a point in this in the questions about, does holistic mean that you're not specific? No, I don't think so. I think holistic means you start with a big picture, but ultimately you're going to have to modularize your approach. There is no such thing as a system that works for everything. It is complicated. It does require careful work, but I think that's the nature of the work. I don't think that we should be hoping for some future where all of a sudden it all just magically works together. You need to pick and choose your battles, but you should be guided by a larger vision, not by how do I want this particular module to work. I think you start with the big picture and then you break it out into solvable problems and then use the technologies that we have to make them work together.
Thank you, Aaron. I'd like to ask Jeff and James directly about the last question, because I think this is a very interesting question. Is the nature of content changing? And do you see less text, more video than text? And if you think like conventional neural networks affecting how we are going to be localizing things? Your thoughts on that?
Jeff, want to take it first, or?
Sure, I can. In my particular role, I have not seen more video than text. Now, that being said, the content consumption habits around the world have been changing and have been moving more toward video and multimedia than text. Not to say that there is not a role for text. I mean, subtitles, we all need subtitles. I even turn on subtitles for English just to make sure that I can follow along with what's going on. Yeah, I do see more of a need for, I guess, multimedia localization. And that being said, I honestly, I don't know. It's an area that I'm not fully familiar with. So I don't know that I'm the best person to comment on the role that neural networks could play in that. James, maybe you have another perspective or more experience in that area?
Yeah, so yeah, sorry, Jeff, to put you on the spot. I was like really thinking on, how neural machine translation or neural network helps with the, content, text, or subtitling, because, I believe that this question is referring to the marketing side, because a lot of marketing side that we have done, it does go through subtitle and video localization, due to the fact that people like to listen, and if they don't understand, then they would love to have a subtitle on their video. And what I have seen in the past is that, as I mentioned, we go every content, including subtitle through machine translation. But then it does have a benefit is that, it goes through machine translation quickly. However, we require additional steps to ensure that the actual terminology that it refers to it, or the style guide, or even some sort of a style tone has to be correctly reviewed. Because, I speak, if I want to speak to a video versus I type in a video, different tone and different, semantic might be different, or even syntactic. And therefore that, we're not really, selling, but we are marketing to the customer on what we're trying to propose. And that's sort of, changing on the tone, I don't think machine translation we're able to pick that up. And that's why we, in our case, we actually do go through our entire TER, translation, editing, and review process, so that we can actually make sure that every intonation, the tones and voices have been correctly adapt to the logo that we are supporting, especially for this marketing side. But yeah, other than that, I don't have any positive and negative feedback about this particular questions. It is, based on my opinion, that's how I feel.
Thank you. There was also a follow-up question from Zultan. With model like GPT-3, which is good in creating human-like language, will we need translation, or will the content be created from scratch in target languages using machine learning application that learn about the environment, culture, and socio-political factors with the target market? Does localization even make sense going forward? I'd like to ask this question, Aaron. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've seen studies and output from GPT-3 that some of them are amazing, and you look at it and you think, how can this even be possible? Almost as is sort of astounding as the new generation of video technology, where it's fake and you would never guess that it's fake. I've also seen both data, studies and output from GPT-3 that when you push it onto the edge, it's kind of falls apart as well. The output is not as great as you would expect. So I do think there's a lot of potential, and that we will see that coming into play. That said, it's like with everything else, it's sort of a new technology opens up new use cases that previously had not been explored for generating content. That does not, in and of itself, in my mind at least, predict that then translation will go away. I think it is a more complex ecosystem than that. I could also see it generating new kinds of jobs, right? So maybe a GPT-3 driven content engine, maybe we don't translate anymore. Maybe it generates in language, but then there's a job for somebody who is doing quality assurance or content selection. So I've seen, you might need to go through that output and then delete every fourth sentence because it's nonsense. But then the other three are perfectly coherent and appropriate. So it just might be a new kind of job to manage that type of content. So that's what I see, with regard to that technology.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time left, and there is a question from Rolf Hecken. Do your forecast include measuring the effort of communication within workflows from A to Z, utilizing repurposed marketing and sales tools to identify and monitor this part of our work?
Can I take that one?
I was just about to ask. Yeah.
Okay, great. No, my personal forecasts don't, but that is a gap that I agree exists. We talk in our industry a lot about ROI, but we all very often, when looking at ROI, we fail to understand that there is a purpose behind all of the content that we are translating and localizing. And being able to tie key metrics on the success of a particular, for example, marketing campaign in a particular language back to the translation efforts or transcreation efforts is very difficult. It involves systems that just don't communicate well with one another. So I do think that that's another piece of the modularization puzzle that hasn't fully been implemented in a localization or a holistic localization ecosystem, but there definitely is a need.
Thank you. Aaron or James, do you like to also elaborate on that one?
I actually agree with Jeff as well. At Uber, right, we don't see, at least at this moment, at least the forecast for the next near future, to have retooling or repurpose a marketing and sales tool to identify the communication, because within the TMS, right, we do have this conversation panel that every translator and reviewer are using this sort of platform to communicate with us, so that in a way that every project that we created, we submitted, we return, every conversation should be within that project, because that we can at least go back weeks from now to track what was the conclusion, what happened, did this person did something or whatever, so that we can at least understand it and move forward with maybe correction and maybe some sort of what's going on, so that we can assess and move on. But at least for my role, right, we're not going to foresee anything that are going to use another tool to address this communication, because I think within the TMS itself already suffice to address that. Thanks.
Thank you. Balazs, I think you're still there. You have.
Yeah, of course I am. Yeah, we still have some leftover questions, which I would like to point out here. For instance, there is this one that goes really from the holistic or the generic that much of this panel was going around to the very specific, and this is being asked by Luz. Earlier, you talked about providing metadata as context when using a TMS. And are screenshots enough as context for translators?
I think screenshot definitely a huge help for translators, and this is something that we are working to provide, not only the screenshot, but then a page of information that what this terminology mean, what the sentence means, so that they can actually accurately translate from the source context. The only problem right now is that how to really feed this information to the CAT tool, TMS, provided by that they can access to this information. Certain, like for example, an app, like a mobile app, to get a screenshot, we require automation from our side to be capture of the new changes, the new UI stream, so that it can pass to the TMS. And then how does TMS pick up using a payload or header file or metadata that can either display the screen or even provide a URL. However, this URL is also a problem because, assuming the URL is behind a firewall, how do you access this URL in the first place? So this all are pain point that we have heard so much about from the translator reviewer, that they need more context so that they can properly translate that. And we heard you, right? From client's point of view, we are also trying to get that through the pipeline into the TMS, into the CAC tool, so that they can get that information and then provide an accurate translation.
And of course, there's that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to agree with James. I think it gets you halfway there, but really there's no substitute for actually interacting within the environment, right? And interacting with the app or the website. Like translators really need to understand the purpose behind pushing a certain button. And you can describe that in an ancillary resource that goes alongside a screenshot. But very often, like, we're talking about human-computer interaction to a certain extent here. And a screenshot is not dynamic. A screenshot doesn't allow for appropriate or comparable interaction between the translator and the piece of software that they're localizing. So it's certainly helpful and gets you a certain degree closer, but there's just no replacement for actually creating an opportunity for interaction.
Thank you very much.
You.
Two more questions, and we have two minutes. So Konstantin asked earlier on about RPA. How real is RPA? How much of it do you do already?
A short answer to Konstantin is, Aaron, go ahead, or
Go ahead.
Yep, it's, RPA is real. We have did a study in our team, and is that we can definitely streamline our processes, especially on those mundane, repetitive tasks such as project handoff, creating projects, or email confirmation or acknowledge, to even a more complex logic such as how do we intelligibly route dozen content into different workflows by having these massive projects. So RPA is real, and I do take it that we're going to focus on this a lot more this coming year and on Uber side.
Yep. And I can just say that we also are using it actively, both on client-side applications and then for internal workflows. So the client-side piece, I'd already given the example that I think a great use case is one where a client has a system that there's no way that there are no API endpoints to communicate with that system. And yet somebody's and I'm sure all of you have seen situations like this where you have to go log in to some system somewhere, click on a bunch of buttons, download a file, take the file, move the file into another system. That's exactly what RPAs are designed to do, as long as it is a predictable process.
Right.
So we see that. We also see it internally. So I'm always looking for, is there a repetitive motion kind of task in our own internal workflows that we could set up an RPA to run and avoid having a human being do that, so that the human can be thinking rather than clicking. So yes, I think the answer is that there's real value in those, and I think a lot of people are already starting to use them.
Thank you, Aaron. Our time is up, unfortunately. So I would actually read out the last question asked by Alessandra. Is just for everybody to ponder on this. As we expect translators to really understand the flow of the content they are translating, can we seriously still expect to pay them by the word? And this is, I think it's a very real question. Well, yeah, because our time is up. Any closing words, very, very quickly, because we're into break at this point. If not, I would like to thank the panel for this conversation. It was an amazing panel. It's really insightful, really valuable. Thank you very much for everybody for putting in all the effort, all the work, and that I think we had the opportunity to learn a lot. Thank you very much, and yeah.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the conference,
and
now on to the break. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Talk to you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.